18, 19, and 20, and it's God's fourth argument supporting the judgment of Israel that is about to take place within about 35 years anyhow. And this will be part one. We'll look at it and finish it up next session. Amos begins God's fourth argument in support of the upcoming judgment of the northern kingdom by giving a statement of woe. Now, most of you know that a woe is sort of the opposite of a blessing. Luke added woes to the Sermon on the Mount, which is all of the blesseds, of course. Well, let's look at verses 18 through 20 of Amos 5. Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord, who long for the day of Yahweh, that is. Why do you long for the day of Yahweh? That day will be darkness, not light. It will be, this is the first point, it will be as though a man fled from a lion only to meet a bear. And then secondly, as though he entered his house and rested his hand on the wall, supposing he was in safety, of course, only to have a snake bite him. So what do you have? A lion, you run into a bear. You run from the bear, you run into your house, and you're bitten by a snake as you lean against the wall. Then he finishes in verse 20, will not the day of Yahweh be darkness, not light, pitch dark, without a ray of brightness, or hope, of course, is what he's referring to with brightness. It'll be a dark day, and it'll be a day without hope. And of course, he's talking to a specific group of people. This is not a general statement. It's a statement of truth for unbelievers, but we'll check that later. Okay, so what does the day of Yahweh or the day of the Lord refer? Well, for us, it refers to the return of Jesus in judgment when he will conquer all his opponents and establish his sovereign, righteous rule over all the earth in what we call the millennial kingdom. The day of Yahweh is apparently a multi-phased time of Yahweh's intervention into human affairs. And what's it going to include? Well, it's going to include an outpouring of terrible judgment, a display of Yahweh's sovereignty and superiority. But it's also going to mean the destruction of all of Israel's enemies and an outpouring of covenantal blessing and restoration for the remnant of Israel. I started to say for Israel, but it's really for the remnant of Israel. It's described by Old Testament prophets such as Jeremiah, Hosea, Micah, Zephaniah. You can find all of those descriptions of that day. And for an unbeliever, it will be a dark day indeed. Now, Israel didn't think of the remnant, as I just spoke a moment ago, as the only beneficiaries of judgment. They erroneously believed that Israel's election was a guarantee of the covenantal blessings for all descendants of Abraham. But it isn't true. They have to be Abraham's blessings or offspring in some way, and in particular in a spiritual way. Amos knew and declared that the Israelites were mistaken. So, question, how extensive will the outpouring of judgment be? Well, let's take a look at a number of judgment-related scriptural references. One that I like in particular, I like because it's very graphic, not because I like everything that's going to happen in it. Zephaniah, we're going to look at chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. And here we're speaking of a judgment on Judah, not Israel, the northern kingdom, but Judah, the southern kingdom. And God is saying, I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth. A little bit of hyperbole, perhaps, declares Yahweh. I will sweep away both men and animals. I will sweep away the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. The wicked will have only heaps of rubble when I cut off man from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. Wow. And look at Jeremiah in chapter 46. We'll look at verse 10. And this is talking about a day of judgment on Egypt. But that day, the day of judgment on Egypt, belongs to Yahweh, the Lord Almighty, a day of vengeance. Remember, God said, vengeance is mine. For vengeance on his foes. The sword will devour till it is satisfied, till it has quenched its thirst with blood. For the Lord Almighty, will offer sacrifice in the land of the north by the river Euphrates. But Israel's view of the day of the Lord was tunnel vision. It was a day of great expectation. Two things, judgment for Gentiles, but vindication and deliverance for the northern kingdom. Again, Amos knew mo better. That's more better for those of you who don't speak Hawaiian. The scriptures have much more to say about the day of the Lord, both in terms of judgment and blessings. For example, judgment of the Gentiles, purification of Gentiles' nations, going back to Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 8. Therefore wait for me, declares Yahweh, for the day I will stand up to testify. I have decided to assemble the nations, that's the Gentiles, to gather the kingdoms, and to pour out my wrath on them, all my fierce anger. The whole world will be consumed by the fire of my jealous anger. Look at Isaiah 34. I'm going to read a couple of verses, 2 and 8. Yahweh is angry with all the nations, the Gentiles. His wrath is upon all their armies. He will totally destroy them. He will give them over to slaughter. And then in verse 8, for Yahweh has a day of vengeance, a year of retribution to uphold Zion's cause. You can see why the northern kingdom believed that God's anger was going to be all aimed at Gentiles and all blessings aimed at the northern kingdom. Blessing, deliverance, restoration of Israel under a new covenant, which is spoken of in the Old Testament also. Look at Zephaniah 3 again. This time verses 14 through 17. Sing, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. You see why the Israelites believed that would be a nice day for them. The Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your enemy. The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. That's in the day of the Lord. On that day they will say to Jerusalem, do not fear, O Zion, do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing. So for us, we simply are saying, wow, look at the difference between those for whom the day will be darkness, unbelievers, and those to whom the day will be blessing, believers in Christ. Ezekiel, another one, 36, verses 24 through 29, a little longer version. For I will take you out of the nation. I'll take you out of the Gentiles. He's talking to Israel now, or to the unified nation perhaps, or even just to Judah. I forget which. It's very likely to Judah, but in either case, it is to Israelites. I will gather you from all of the countries and bring you back into your own land. And that's going to be a day of the Jews coming back to their own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you for purification, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I wonder if that verse has something to do with how some denominations baptize. That's just a question. Verse 26, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. Same thing that Jeremiah spoke of in chapter 33, I believe it is. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will pour out my spirit on you and move you to follow my decrees, to be faithful, to be obedient, and be careful to keep my laws. You will live in the land I gave your forefathers, going all the way back to Abraham. You will be my people. I will be your God. Those of you with us in Hosea, remember that my people and not my people were the names of two of Hosea's children. I will save you from all your uncleanness. And even in Isaiah, this would be what? The fourth prophet we've looked at speaking about this day. And we're not even finished with Daniel and Joel. Isaiah 24:23, speaking of the day of the Lord again. The moon will be abashed, the sun ashamed, for the Lord Almighty will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem. Mount Zion quite often is a reference to Jerusalem. And before its elders gloriously. What about Daniel and Job? Well, they insert a cautionary note about individual salvation in connection with this national deliverance. Daniel 12:1, for example. At that time, Michael, remember the archangel responsible for Israel. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people Israel, that is the unified nation, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of nations until now. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. And we know what book that is. And Joel chapter 2, verse 31, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. The well-known verse. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance, as the Lord has said, among the survivors whom the Lord calls. Remember, not every Jew goes into the millennial kingdom. But Israel too will be purified for that day. And that's a day that is a little bit something that Israel probably doesn't like to speak about. Purification, yes, but the process, probably not. On that day, when both curses and blessings of the Mosaic covenant are going to be fully activated. Look at Zechariah chapter 13. In this case, verse 1. On that day, a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. So the entire house of David, the entire Jewish nation, will be cleansed from impurity, but look at the condition. Chapter 13 of Zechariah, verses 7 and 8. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is close to me, declares the Lord Almighty. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. In the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 will be struck down and perish. So there, it seems to me, is the purging of Israel. It will cost 2/3 of them their life. Yet 1/3, that's a remnant, of course, will be left in it. Thus the third, or this third, I will bring into the fire, so they're going to be purified even. I will refine them like silver and test them like gold. They will call on my name and I will answer them. I will say, here we go again, they are my people. And they will say, Yahweh is our God. So all four of the prophets agreed that the day of the Lord can be dark or it can be very bright. So which comes first, blessing or judgment? Well, let me go back to Zechariah 14:1. A day of the Lord is coming when your plunder will be divided among you. And here's first. I will gather all of the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. The city will be captured, the houses ransacked, the women raped. Half of the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be taken from the city. So first comes the downside of it. Then in verse 3, then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. So Zechariah says the purging by this warlike effort comes first, and then the day of blessing. And Ezekiel in chapter 20, verses 34 through 38 says, I will bring you from the nations and gather you from the countries. That's a common theme, of course, the bringing back of all the Jews, where you've been scattered, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and an outpoured wrath. I will bring you into the desert of the nations, and there, face to face, I will execute judgment upon you. So judgment first. As I judged your fathers in the desert of the land of Egypt, so I will judge you, declares the sovereign Lord. You remember in Egypt, an entire generation, except for 2 people, perished. And then the next generation, the remnant, if you please, went into the promised land. Similar sort of thing here. God is saying, I will take note of you as you pass under my rod. Notice, not pass over as in Egypt, but pass under. And I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. I will purge you of those who revolt and rebel against me. There goes the 2/3. Although I will bring them out of the land where they are living, yet they will not enter the land of Israel. That is, those who are lost in the purge, just as in the Exodus again. Then you will know that I am Yahweh. In other words, you will know that I am. And Jesus spoke further about this in Matthew 25, verses 32, 33, and 34. And he's talking about end times again. All the nations will be gathered before him. That's Jesus speaking of himself. And he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on the right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. But now we jump to verse 41. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, and into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. So the day of the Lord will be a time of both sovereign judgment for some, great hope for others. As a part of our takeaways, let me say this. The purging of the unified nation is what creates the remnant, the nucleus of the people under the new covenant is spoken of by Jeremiah and Ezekiel too. The judgment of the Gentile nations is the basis for the reversal of the fortunes of that remnant. Objects of God's love, not his wrath. That's the remnant. For the remnant, elimination of all enemies. For the remnant, peace and security with no threat of war. For the remnant, enjoyment of enemy lands and possessions as plunder. For that remnant, salvation, not destruction. And for that remnant, international fame and honor rather than shame and reproach. So for the regathered nation of Israel, it will be a day of glorious revival for the remnant. Just a suggestion. It'll be worthwhile for your understanding of future times and the day of the Lord to read all of Zephaniah. Now, it's only a 3-chapter book. Won't take you half an hour to read it. I suggest you read Zephaniah to get the full taste and flavor of what we're talking about. Question, can salvation of the elect be fully accomplished without the full judgment of evil? Apparently not. So remember, the judgment of the evil comes first, and then the glory of the remnant, or for the remnant. So how about some comments on the lion, bear, and snake? It's one of those, we used this the other day. Cheer up, things could get worse. I cheered up. Sure enough, things got worse. I saw the lion, I ran. I saw the bear, I ran into my house of safety, and a snake bit me. There will be no place of rest or refuge on the day of the Lord, at least for the wicked there will not be. Perhaps we fought the big foes, but what about the deadly little foes? The little snake, for example. Israel had faced Egyptians, Philistines, Syrians, and other enemies, but gave in to smug complacency and ended up in idolatry. Those not reformed by the judgments of God will be pursued by those judgments. Remember, God brings judgment and discipline for the purpose of restoration. But if there is no repenting and turning to God, there will be continued judgment. So, a couple more takeaways. The day of the Lord must be taken seriously. That day is not going to allow any time for repentance. On that day, if you have not repented, too late. But that day will be glorious for true born-again Christians. Well, in our next session, we're going to complete the second